Hello, I'm Avi Lewis, and we're back on the map. We've been talking tonight about new U.S. plans for a war on drugs in Afghanistan. But let's get back now to the war most people are familiar with. This week, Canadians are painfully aware that we're at war in Afghanistan. But Canadian troops are fighting in the complex terrain of the wider NATO mission. This is the largest NATO combat operation ever, with dozens of countries involved and more than 35,000 soldiers. That includes 17,000 U.S. troops. But here's something that's not often made clear. There are also 8,000 more U.S. soldiers acting autonomously and with a very different purpose. The NATO mission's focus is counterinsurgency, where political considerations about impacts on civilians are supposed to have equal weight with military objectives. Meanwhile, the independent U.S. force is in counterterrorism mode, hunting al-Qaeda, frequently using airstrikes for cover, and responsible for the majority of civilian casualties. And that's partly because the top priority is simply to kill the so-called enemy. Now, the tension between the NATO and U.S. approaches is long-standing, though no one wants to talk about it, at least not publicly. Who knows what they're saying privately as the Prime Minister meets with NATO Secretary General Jaap de Hoop Scheffer, who's in Canada at a crucial moment and as support for the war in Afghanistan continues to fall. Tomorrow, he'll ride a military parade into a protest in Quebec City. Earlier today, we talked to him from Montreal. Jaap de Hoop Scheffer, thanks for being on the map.
Thank you.
So let's start today with where many Canadians' heads are today, and the Canadians who were killed recently in Afghanistan. They were killed in what was thought to be a safe area for them. Something about the way the war is being waged in Afghanistan seems to be creating more local resistance, not less. Is it not time for a major reevaluation of tactics?
No, I don't think so. Despite the dramatic loss of the 3 Canadian soldiers yesterday and the many casualties Canada has seen, the strategy as it is conducted in Afghanistan is the right one. The only thing we see, of course, is that the opponents, the Taliban, are using more and more suicide attacks, roadside bombs, to frighten the forces and frighten the troops and unfortunately and dramatically to kill them from time to time in Afghanistan. At the same time, of course, by doing that, trying to influence in a negative way public opinion in Canada and the other partners in the alliance.
Last month I saw this grabbed my eye. The New York Times ran a big story headlined, "Civilian Deaths Undermine War on Taliban." And it cited American-led airstrikes, raids on homes and shootings of civilians on the street and at checkpoints by U.S. Special Forces. Since that article a month ago, there have been dozens more civilians killed. Tell me honestly about the tension between the American war on terror tactics and NATO's more hearts and minds approach. Is that tension not the fatal flaw in the mission?
No, I do not think so, because, but let me start by saying that every innocent civilian life is one too many. And we are doing everything we can, and when I say we, I mean NATO, ISAF. I mean the American-led coalition, and first and foremost the Afghan government. It's their nation, it's their country, their civilian casualties, to see how we can even more and even better improve our rules of engagement and our procedures to avoid civilian loss of life.
No, forgive me, but I'm not really asking about the NATO strategy, because you are getting the blowback from the American strategy, because the majority of civilian casualties are coming from a more aggressive hunt and kill terrorist approach that the Americans are using. That's what NATO forces are facing the backlash from.
No, I don't think so, because of course NATO and the coalition are in very close touch. The rules are the same, and we are trying everything we can to prevent that. But what I was trying to say is that we should never forget that the large majority of Afghan civilians are killed by the Taliban in roadside bombs, in suicide attacks, where the suicide attacker doesn't shy away of taking his wife and children with him in a car, which is developed into a bomb. We have to avoid it the best we can, but we are not in the same moral category as our opponents.
I want to talk about a possible change in tactics, even though you've sort of rejected any notion of it. Last month, the Afghan Senate held a formal vote and passed by overwhelming majority a motion calling for direct talks with the Taliban. And the Afghan Senate also urged Western troops to halt the hunt for Taliban fighters. Meanwhile, here in Canada, a poll last month found that 2-to-1 support for Canadians. 63% of Canadians supporting negotiating directly with the Taliban. So you've got pressure in Afghanistan from the Karzai-friendly Senate, and you've got pressure in NATO countries. Where do you stand, personally, on negotiating with the Taliban?
And the Afghans should decide for themselves what they do, and President Karzai should decide what he wants to do with emotion in Parliament in Afghanistan. And if he wants to negotiate with the Taliban or elements from the Taliban, that is his call. That is not something a NATO Secretary General should comment on, because that is simply outside the reign of the responsibility of the international community.
Let's talk briefly about the opium industry. We've been talking about U.S. plans to bring a Colombia-style war on drugs to Afghanistan. Our show is focused on it tonight. The DEA has brought Colombians to Afghanistan, and Afghan trainees have gone to Colombia for counter-narcotics training. The new U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan is the former ambassador to Colombia. Do you think that the exporting of the war on drugs paradigm to Afghanistan is a good idea? Will that make NATO forces safer?
The immense and intense narcotics problem in Afghanistan is, first of all, the responsibility of the Afghan government. The Afghan government finally decides what to do or what not to do. NATO forces, Canadian forces and all the other 25 allies are in Afghanistan to create a climate of security and stability in which reconstruction can take place.
But once again, we're talking about a kind of U.S. autonomous strategy which is going to have effects for Canadian troops, for wider NATO troops, and of course for Afghan society. And
well,
I get the sense that you really don't support this war on drugs approach, but you're sort of diplomatically unable to say so.
It is not a matter of supporting or not supporting this approach. NATO has no prime responsibility for fighting narcotics. NATO has its hands full, as we see every day, in creating this climate of security and stability. And NATO is not going to take on any prime responsibility or major responsibility for fighting the admittedly immense problem of narcotics. I think Canadian and Dutch and Danish and UK forces have their hands full, and the Germans and Spain and Italians as well, in doing what they have to do in the framework of the NATO mission.
But this is precisely my point. I mean, we've just seen a report that was made public under an access to information process this week that revealed that top Canadian government officials were warned last fall, and I'm quoting now, that any aggressive clampdown on the opium trade would create hardship for large numbers of Afghan citizens and would pose added threats to security and political stability, and could add to the vulnerability of ISAF. So the safety of troops under your leadership is at risk in this emerging policy of drug eradication. I'm giving you an opportunity to publicly oppose it.
I'm giving President Karzai an opportunity through your camera to decide in cooperation with the international community what he wants to do in drug eradication. And the point you are making teaches me that if you do not embed your campaign against narcotics in the wider framework of development cooperation, of nation building and reconstruction, it will fail. You cannot just go to a farmer and say, I've come to eradicate your poppy field, by not giving him anything in return, because the man has to feed his family, he has to make a living. In other words, as we have seen in many parts of the world, counter-narcotics is an extremely complex operation. But I say again, here comes the but you might not like, but the but is that NATO's remit and NATO's operational responsibilities are to create a climate for reconstruction and development, and not to be prime responsible for counter-narcotics.
Jaap de Hoop Scheffer, thank you so much for being on The Map.
Thank you very much.
After the break, glass houses. A viewer calls us out on our coverage of free trade in Colombia. On Your Mind, on The Map, right after this.
Thinking of